I think what we'll do the same as what we did with the last panel, and you'll do self-introduction. So I'll start with Grant and then move this way.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Grant Walsum. I'm with XCG Consulting, and I'm also the chair of QPCO, former chair of the ONEA Excess Soils Working Group. I come at this from a couple of different perspectives, but really I'm looking at things like we're asking a contracting development industry to make significant changes on how things were done, and Peter did speak to this earlier. These are behavioral changes in the tried and true industry that, soils work and development, movement of soils. Companies are cost sensitive and under a lot of time pressures that sometimes can seem unreasonable. Weather also impacts what we do in this province. So this all takes time, but what this regulation has done is really provided a system to provide assurances that soil being relocated is acceptable for reuse on the reuse sites and not creating nuisances, impacts the human health and the environment. So no undue cost to innocent parties that are taken advantage of by misrepresented soil quality. So that's kind of where I'm going to come at from today.
Well, good afternoon. My name is Sanjay Coelho. I've been a member of the Excess Soil team for a number of years at the Ministry of the Environment, Conservation and Parks. I'm here. I've been a part of developing this regulation for quite some time. And, when I started, we very back then, we were developing the framework. Then the framework became the regulation in November 2019. And a few amendments have been done since. So really glad to chat with you all today. And it's really neat to come here because, you go onto the wall and you'll see things like Class 1 sites and all that. So it's a little bit inspirational to me, actually, to see you folks and to see how you're taking this piece that we put together with lots of your input and how you're running with the football. So I respect that.
Hi, everyone. I'm Frecia Waxman. I'm a senior environmental engineer with Grounded Engineering. I'm also a member of QPCO, and I have had the privilege throughout my career so far to field a lot of questions about this regulation from many different business lines and different aspects, a wide range of clients. And so I hope to provide some best industry practices advice today.
Ryan Menez, Director of Business Development for GFL Soils. I think you've already heard me spiel about what GFL does, but I'm going to come to this panel from a best practice of receiving sites. Sanjay alluded to Class 1s. You have lots of options: landfills, Class 2s, reuse sites on projects. So at GFL, we've kind of experimented with a lot of these best practices, doing BRATs on a couple of our sites as well. So definitely, trying to help create, shape, and create a gold standard for the industry as we work through it. I think a commentary about just 406, the regulation, it's really focused on the source site. So no two receiving sites are the same. We have a number of sites and they all have different nuances in the ECAs. When they're open, what kind of soil they can take, road access, so things like that. So, it's really important to know that this regulation is really source site specific, and then the receiving sites kind of are governed under their own principles or documents or instruments as well. So,
okay, thanks for the overview. So we'll start with Sanjay. How is the Ontario government managing industry reaction to the excess soil regulation, and what are some of the sources of information or education programs that you would recommend to keep everyone in this room and elsewhere informed of the updates and what's happening?
Okay, so thank you for the question. And so basically, the way that we are seeking to manage industry reaction is through having really fluid lines of communication. We have something called, since 2016, we've had something called the Excess Soil Engagement Group. That group has met about 15 or 20 times, about 3 times a year roughly. It includes 80 stakeholders. In fact, a number of folks in the room are a part of it. Basically, we have industry there, we have municipalities, we have environmental groups, and what it's been basically is a sounding board where we come to them with policy ideas and proposals and things in their infancy. And they've also come to us with issues that they experience on the ground and so forth. But in addition to the ESCG, there's also a fair number of meetings, whether they're meetings with lots of staff or just a phone call with somebody. Just yesterday I was on the phone with somebody talking about trucks and locking systems and fascinating things like that. So the point is that we've had lots of communication. And one of the things that's manifested in, you talk about managing stakeholder reaction, is that there have been amendments to the reg since it came into effect. I will say, because I've lived it, that there have been a fair number of emails and phone calls and meetings, and conferences. We're here today. We're so glad to be here. We went to Connect some weeks ago, which was a great event. We were so glad to be there, and numerous smaller meetings and so forth. And one of the things that this manifests itself in has been some of these regulatory amendments. So, we've actually I was surprised when I looked at it, but we amended the reg in 2020 because of this little thing, we call it COVID. So, that affected the in effect dates of some things, Then later that year, we did a few more amendments, and it actually some things like grandfathering and so forth were addressed there. Then in 2022, we had this thing that we call the excess soil pause. So, just for everybody's awareness, the pause absolutely did not pause all the requirements. So I was so appreciative of those comments earlier that were about that. The requirements that were paused are coming back into effect. And now, of course, we have just closed on Saturday. And big shout out to those who spent a bit of time over the weekend to wrap it up, because I know there are some of you out there. We had an ERO posting close about the low risk sites and the storage piece as well. So the bottom line is very simply that industry and other stakeholders have come to us and they've said, well, what about this? Okay, well, good point. Maybe we can make an amendment for that. Well, what about that? I don't think we can do that one quite as easily, or that really works. It's all about what comes out of the wash. But there's lots of meetings, lots of conferences. Now, what else are we doing? Because we clearly do have a fair bit of communication. We have a website. It is, if you Google Excess Soil Ontario, the heading on it's Handling Excess Soil. And so there we have 3 fact sheets posted currently. We have a fact sheet for project areas, also known as source sites. We have a fact sheet for reuse sites, and we have a fact sheet related to transportation. We also have some other information there about how the reg and rules and everything works. We've also worked with partners, and there are some partners we're working with now. I won't get into that so much, except to say that we're aware, one of the areas that we're looking at guidance in is about what the reuse sites ask for in this whole process, right? So we are aware of that being something to think about, and we're working with a party on that. But the 3 guidance pieces that I can say were absolutely finalized and are out there for your consideration was the Canadian Urban Institute's bylaw language tool. I worked with, I was their liaison on that. ONEA, credit to ONEA, did hauling best practices and also class 2 management site best practices, and they did sessions and so forth. And our friends at OSPE, or the Ontario Society of Professional Engineers, and the Ontario Stone, Sand and Gravel Association, they also developed guidance. So I don't think we ever perceived ourselves in 2 things. I don't think we ever perceived. Number one, that the regulation would have no room for improvement, because, while we think that there's hopefully a sound framework, that along the way, we've had talks with industries and other that have helped improve it. And second, I don't think that we do it. We don't think that we're doing it all by ourselves, and we are very appreciative of those partners we've worked with who are helping carry the football as well. So overall, just to summarize it, I'd say, emails, meetings, phone calls, conferences, webinars. I forgot to mention that we had a project area webinar with about 250 people. I think I presented that one, November 30th. And tomorrow we will have a reuse site webinar, again, about 250 people. Some of the key things I'll absolutely take away, and I know already, is that, if there were more fact sheets, that's great. We know that there's interest. If there are more webinars, we know that there would be interest. So you can take, we do know those things, and we also are working with our partners, and we know that we're not alone in this. So thank you very much to everybody who's participated with us.
I think what we're hearing, and we heard this morning from Jen and others, that there really is a partnership here. So for example, ONEA and Grant and many others worked on creating these best practices guides. I think the one on hauling is probably 70 pages or something like that, and it gets into details not only about the regs, but there are links to MTO guidelines with respect to the safety of trucks. So maybe, Grant, you just want to talk about how you created some of those guides a little bit.
Sure. Is this on? Yep. Okay. Yeah, we were tasked with the ministry in about 2020, I believe, to come up with those 3 best practice documents. And it wasn't just a couple of people from ONEA sitting together across the table saying, how are we going to do this? We brought together roundtables of people from those specific areas to look at what the content of those documents would be, and what's acceptable, and what's, how would we operate within the province around those topics. So the hauling one, it wasn't Grant Walsum sitting there throwing stuff against the wall. We brought haulers in and spoke to them at length during COVID, mind you. So this was really the testing for us on Zoom calls and so forth, and how to conduct those meetings. Draft documents went around about 3 times amongst that group and through the ministry, I might add, when Laura Blease was there. She spent a lot of time with us on that as well. So each of those 3 documents were developed with stakeholders around that topic, and through roundtables of a minimum of about 20 people. So it was an industry-led document created by people of the industry for use by the industry. So although the ministry doesn't have their name on it, they certainly were fully supportive of it and tasked us with doing that, which we're very proud of the products that are there. They are posted on the ONEA website. You can go there and access those at your leisure.
Sure, please.
Yeah, when we were developing all these documents, it was during the height of COVID. You're rolling out a massive regulation, and everyone's in their basements working from home with their kids yelling in the background, no daycare, no schools. So it was very difficult, and we did our best as an industry to get the word out to those that wanted to listen. This is all the stuff that we've done as an industry. Now it's January 1st is less than a month away, and there is no pause, which was everything's gone. So I kind of look at I referee hockey as well for 25 years, and I look at the next phase of rules enforcement. When hitting from behind was a big thing. They put stop signals on everyone's back of their jerseys, so that really got hitting from behind out, and head checks and stuff like that. So now we're moving into the enforcement phase as well, and how the ministry will approach that will be important. Matt Gardner and the legal panel got up here, talked about there's no precedent been set yet. You don't want to be the first person that gets the precedent sent on you. So looking at how the project leaders are approaching these projects, how they're contracting it out, will also create best practices for to follow the rules. And yeah.
Risha, did you want to weigh in as well?
I know that Sanjay mentioned a bunch of the groups that they're working with. There are others in the background, so if there's a particular concern that you have, it's probably the MECP is aware of it, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't voice it, and make sure that your concerns are heard, is mine.
Okay, thank you. We'll move on to question number 2. About 2 or 3 weeks ago, the Canadian Councils of Ministers of the Environment, CCME for short, go away, released some guidelines for across Canada on kind of soil best practices from coast to coast. I'm just wondering, Grant, you had raised this during our conference call last week. Could you comment a bit on the CCME document?
Sure. CCME has come up with a draft guidance document. It's posted as of the end of November for comment until January, early January. So it might be worthwhile to take a look at that. It's pretty easy to find on the website. It takes account regulatory tools of the different provinces to establish a framework that can be adopted by all. Couple of the things that I got when I was reviewing it was it's based on the principle of beneficial reuse, which is very important. And it has a framework for appropriate characterization of soil, documentation, soil management plans for the soil source sites, fill management plans for the reuse sites, employment of QPs to ensure contamination and contaminants are identified and appropriately managed with a level of diligence and accountability, which was a word that came up a couple of times, which I really caught my eye. Avoids the creation of new contaminated sites through the movement of soil, and sustainable reuse and its objective through balance of risks and costs with promoting the best and highest use of the soil. And traceability is also part of that. One thing I will point out, though, this is not regulation, this is guidance. It is meant to cover off different areas of the country. So there are some things in there that may be applicable in some areas and not, and they're very good at pointing out that certain things like a QP may be defined as something in Ontario, but maybe define something differently in BC and what have you. So they do try to cover off those things. So I think looks like it could be promising for those provinces that maybe don't have excess soil regulations, or for federal properties and so forth. But I do point out it is guidance, but I do believe that it will become a nice tool in the toolbox for anybody who's doing excess soil management.
Okay, anyone else want to weigh in, or who has read the CCME document so far?
I have not read the CCME document yet.
But if anyone in this room is working across Canada, it's probably a good place to become familiar with some of the differences, Quebec, Ontario, BC, and so forth.
Right. No, Andy, I should add the best practice about all these documents that are happening. I think the one thing that you're going to allude to is QP engagement. A lot of these projects, yeah, sorry, I plugged you out. Yeah, I had to do it, right? You guys are the QPs, so there's your plug. No. QPs are getting involved in new projects, and environmental engineers are working on road building projects, sewer and water main breaks, pipelines. Traditional projects maybe where environmental engineering, or it's been geotech testing only. So now there's new steps, and this is across Canada. So if these guidelines are adopted, there's going to be more QP involvement earlier, and it's in a team approach. I think we've heard this team and early engagement are major themes that are going to develop from today as well.
I think we should have subtitled this conference "Hire a QP." So.
Just to add to that, Andy, I think one of the best things that we can do as a best practice is, although there may be some relaxing of certain aspects in Ontario, the early and appropriate characterization with good representative documentation is really going to be key as a best practice across the industry, whether or not it's regulated or not. Too often is going to happen is that you're going to try to move soil that's not characterized, not documented, and the reuse site's going to say, no, thank you. And the next one down the road is going to say, no, thank you. And the next one down the road is going to say, no, thank you, because you don't have anything for us to rely on. This is against the principles of the regulation, which was local reuse, minimization of excess soil, and minimization of trucking material across the province. So, if we can do these things, and granted, there's not always going to be those opportunities, but more often than not, there can be appropriate documentation done. Registration, I think, is still important, although it may be taken off the table for certain aspects. I still think that is a very important aspect as well.
Okay, thank you. The next question, I think, is going to seamlessly tie into this one, but let me just give a little overview. A number of years ago, there were some estimates put out about the volume of excess soil generated in the province, and the best figure, and it still continues to be used, 7 years later, is 25 million cubes. And I think one of the lessons is that if you don't measure it, you're not going to improve. And so I think part of what we're trying to do with the regulation is to have better outcomes. So are we reusing soil on site or for other projects? So question number 3 is, what are the key best management practices or best practices that cleanup industries can undertake to prepare for the significant changes ahead? And supplementary to that, what's the key piece of advice you would like to give? Some have suggested that this is contacting a QP, so that's the segue. Sure.
Yeah. Sure. Oh, thank you. Early planning, 100%. We talk about those numbers, 25 million cubes. The demand of soil or excess soil in the marketplace far exceeds the supply of available disposal space, depending on the soil qualities, obviously. There are a lot of, the ministry has also moved the bar and made new soil standards. So table 2 is now table 2.1, and it's become more stringent. So those reuse sites that have been permitted under table 2 effectively can't take the same soil qualities as of January 1st, 2023. So that creates, where does the soil go? Now you look at the planning. I talk to clients that are early engaging on some projects 3, 4, 5 years in advance. What are our options? How many samples should we be taking? What are some soil management plans? So you talk about some of the large scale projects on the marketplace, the subway tunnels, the LRTs in Ottawa. Kitchener just finished their LRT. These are yielding hundreds of thousands of cubic meters of soil. Granted, we all are involved in small tank pulls, smaller jobs or 5,000 ton jobs, which are expensive, but they may not have a home for the soil because these larger projects are taking up all the available space. So again, the earlier you're planning these projects will definitely help you down the road. So if you're typically planning it at the tendering stage, go 2 steps back from that. Call a QP. So it's really getting ahead of the horse, getting ahead of the game, and that's where I've seen a lot of successes on some of these larger scale projects for sure so far.
If I could just move on down the line, Frigid, let me amend the question a little bit. Are there any pieces of advice you can give with respect to not only the larger contractors or projects, municipal or otherwise, but the smaller ones? Because I think that's where some of the challenges may lie.
Yeah, so the same hire a QP, plan ahead, excuse me, that all applies. But I would recommend that once you hire that QP, you really dig into how your soil movement is going to take place on your site. Do you need a soil management plan? Are you going to generate liquid soil? Like, these are things that kind of come up as afterthoughts sometimes, and your QP is left scrambling to get a plan in place to deal with these with you. But walk through how the excavation is going to be staged. Do you have room to stockpile? Don't you? What's the timing for all of this? And if you know the reuse site or where you would like it to go ideally, that sets you so far ahead of the game. So
I can keep going. I think that what the panel is coming up with is very sound. And if you look at our fact sheet on project areas, you'll see that we talk about on-site reuse. So the bottom line is very simply from the regulation. Generally, soil staying on-site is not a waste and wouldn't be. So yes, early soil planning, hiring a QP, these are all things we talk about there as well. With regards to developing an excess soil plan, again, that's not required. That is a best practice that's in our fact sheet. Basically, what you would do is bring together all these reports and you have a QP hired and so forth. And it would be a coherent approach. Now, please defer to the fact sheet for our formally what our official line is on this. But the bottom line is that having early planning and really considering early reuse, remembering, the name of the regulation is the excess soil regulation. If it doesn't go off site, basically, there is a small nuance where it can become a waste, but generally, if it stays on site, it does not become a waste. So, think about that. Early planning, proactive, and thinking about what's a wise investment for your project and what will pay you dividends over the long run.
Just to follow up on that, as a QP, a consultant and founder of QP Co., I would say hiring a QP is always good advice. But just to echo the other panelists, early studies and characterization is really important. Get the full delineation of contaminants. It allows for planning. Project design where remedial activities may be required or different types of soil need to go to different places. That can be incorporated into the development plan. Allows you to find appropriate locations for the material, hopefully locally, hopefully close by, or aligning projects where one is being cut, another needs filled, that type of thing. Project staging, so all really good. And whether or not it's a requirement, I think it's still going to be a best practice to do those things as early and as often as you can on projects.
I think in some of the guidance documents that ONEA put together, they talked about contingency planning. And I think because of the, let's say, the limited number of reuse sites, what about planning let's call it a plan B, for lack of a better phrase. You have sites that you've got lined up and all of a sudden something changes for whatever reason. What's the good advice for, the project owner through the QP to give on that one? I threw that one in there. That wasn't written down before.
Again, having a plan B. So there, hopefully you have one that's really great, the right price, nice and local, but having that plan B is really important, and a second site that might be maybe not as quite as ideal, but could be used at the last minute if required, and getting their approval. Having your Form 180s and those types of things signed, that they will accept the material as a requirement of that contract. Those types of things. So having plan B is really important.
Yeah, you don't. Another hockey analogy: you don't take one hockey stick to a game, right? So you need to always have a backup, and that's pretty much early planning. On the registry, you can put as many sites as you want about where you plan on taking your soil. I don't think the excess soil destination reports are limited to soil to the sites. So cover all your bases, because we see in tendering a lot of the times people will contact us for pricing, and then, like Grant said, a local project, which is the spirit of the regulation, next door, Bob needs 1,000 tons, and here you go. So the spirit of the regulation is to keep it on site or to limit the amount of truck traffic. So, but yeah, you do have to have all your bases covered.
Okay. Let me do a third part to question 3, which is not on our list, so hopefully our panel, who's very good, can. So transportation plans. Often around the GTA, we're going to see all sorts of, backups. When I was taking the 407 more often, I started seeing anecdotally more trucks with soil driving on that because they could do more return trips. So could we have someone talk about kind of a route optimization as part of reducing GSGs and all the ESG kind of metrics?
Not too well versed on this one. I do know that in downtown Toronto, for some of the projects, they mandate truck traffic plans. So which ways are you going? Staying off the roads. So there is early planning. You talk about. I think we've talked about ESG a little bit today. I think one thing that the consulting community can kind of chew on is we have lead credits for above grade. How you're building your buildings, what kind of windows you're using, HVAC, water. I think the engineering community and us as a whole, we should start thinking about lead credits for subgrade. If we're saving trucks, if we're beneficially reusing soil, there's value in that. We're saving greenhouse gas emissions. So these are, it's not a best practice, it's probably a futuristic approach. Putting these things in tenders, you see that the soil washing plant out in the west on Vancouver Island, they were successful in getting soil in a city's tender. An amount of soil needs to be beneficially reused. So you're starting to see these little early pieces coming into tenders, and that's where it's going to invoke change. Most of these businesses are processes and tried and tested processes, and that's how they operate. We have to change the game by influencing it at the tendering stage and providing more tools to limit the amount of trucks. I know it's not a transportation plan, but that's how I spun it, sorry.
Okay. Anyone else?
Many of the haulers, they're paid by the load, and they want to get as many loads as they can in the day as they can do safely. And so minimizing traffic impacts is to their best interest. Every time I've been out on site and working with the haulers and talking to them, they know long before the news knows about an accident somewhere because they are on their radios and they've got their Waze apps and so forth. So I think they're going to look after that themselves because that's how they're paid and that's how they go. It's not in their interest to be sitting in traffic at any length of time.
Okay, so they know more about cost-benefit analyses than we do. Okay. Number 4, how are construction companies changing the way they manage excavated materials? For those involved in major projects, how are best practices being rethought? And this is going to Ryan to start.
Yeah, some of these projects, again, are yielding large volumes, and I'll poke on Toronto again, the tunneling projects. The environmental community, we've had this excess soil definition of soil mixed with rock, or is it just rock? These TBM spoils. Now you're dealing with material that can't necessarily be transported because it's liquid soil. Putting it into hydrovacs is cost prohibitive. So what are these projects doing? They're building muck pits. They're building on-site solidification units to tighten up the soils. So they're trying to manage as much soil on site and getting it to a stronger state that passes slump. It opens up your reuse site options exponentially if you can do that. Another thing that I'm seeing happen a lot is they're resampling. A lot of clients are on site. They're using their GBR, their environmental data, but then they're also supplementing it with due diligence sampling as it's coming out as well. Puts a lot of pressure on the labs. Puts a lot of pressure on the contractors and operationally and on the receiving sets as well. But you're starting to see these, they're not just taking the one document and rolling the whole project that way. The costs are too escalating, and there's other ways to start managing these projects.
Yeah, we've also seen some large municipal contracts where they have specified within the contract where the material will go. So they've stated what the reuse site will be ahead of time. And I think that that's definitely one route that would be really good for other municipalities to explore as well.
This is where the government listens and learns. So I want to keep listening and learning.
Duly noted.
Better start over there again. Excuse me. Some of the things I like to see that are happening now is there's more attention being paid to stripping topsoil that can be reused, either back on the site or on a different site. Reclaiming aggregate material. You're doing a road job, you pull the asphalt up. That subbase in most cases is really good and should be reused. I think we're going to start to see a secondary market for that type of material, much like we're seeing for asphalt and concrete. I took the 407. There's a massive place just at Kiel there that's got recycled asphalt, and they take it, they grind it up, and they reuse it. I think the subbase can be probably reused, and I think we should be looking to that, and municipalities to start operating the local waste transfer facilities to their benefit and reusing some of that material that's generated on their own projects that can be reused on their projects again. So I know there's geotechnical considerations for that type of reuse. However, I think that this is what we're going to start seeing, and the contractors are going to start becoming in tune with that because there's cost savings, there could be time savings and so forth, but gone are the days of just sticking the shovel in the ground and dumping it in a dump truck and sending it off. I think the material segregation is going to be very important as we move forward. Did you learn something?
Hope so.
Okay.
I think I did.
Grant, just picking up off the local waste transfer, I'm been talking about large projects, but at the municipal level, we're seeing a lot of municipalities for smaller catch basins, broken water mains that they didn't plan, and they have soil, they're generating it, and what are they doing? They're being smart now. They're bringing it to their works yard, using it as a local waste transfer. So they retain ownership, they don't have to sample, and then they're stockpiling the soils at these sites and then getting it into a larger pile to then call QP and sample and then contract out other, they reuse it. The city of Hamilton actually has a really good program going on. They either reuse it as subbase, they reuse it at their parks, or they're really minimizing what they need to dispose of at the end of the day. So yeah, it's a really good approach that some municipalities are taking.
Okay, thank you. Number 5, it's going to be a little bit more technical. We've touched upon tunneling, and we've also touched upon liquid and shale. I don't think we've really talked about stormwater ponds yet, which is another emerging area since many of those are decades old and they silt up and everything. So Frisia, could you let us know about the various technical areas that you've been dealing with in some of these sites?
Sure, thanks. So I think a lot of us are aware that, tunneling spoils, liquid soil, shale, these are all issues that could deserve their own talks individually. So I'm just going to briefly touch on each of them. So for tunneling spoils, my best piece of advice would be to think really critically about how you define your project area when you're setting up those types of projects. try and allow as much of the processing and dewatering to happen within your project area so you reap the benefits of the dewatering applications that you're allowed to use under this new regulation. And you don't need to take it to a waste transfer facility. You don't need to take it to a Class 1 soil management site. Wouldn't it be nice if we could take it all to a Class 2 soil management site that's meant to facilitate infrastructure projects? But that's not allowed under this regulation yet. I don't know if it ever will be, but it would be lovely. As for liquid soil,
You wrote it down. There you go.
as for liquid soil, obviously the same project area definition is key. But when we're talking about your projects or sites where you have hydro excavation taking place, an area that I think that we as an industry are really falling flat is filling out those hauling records properly. I have a site and we've seen drivers come to the site and they don't have the source site information filled out properly. And I know that this is happening across Ontario. The reasons are probably a few. One is that just the nature of hydro excavation, sometimes you're grabbing soil from multiple small project areas, and how do you put all of those onto a hauling record? You need to think about these things ahead of time. And then some of the drivers, English is a second language, so they may not be confident or comfortable to ask for this information. So my best advice here would be, if you are involved in a project that has hydro excavation, please ensure that there are processes in place to make sure that that source site information is being populated. They're being turned away at the reuse sites. And guess what? Now the ministry has to play whack-a-mole with all of the illegal dump sites that are popping up. So we can all help stem the tide and turn this around. On shale, there's so many issues with shale, but I guess Ryan mentioned that there's this definition of crushed rock. And so when you excavate shale, is it crushed rock or is it rock? Is it less than 2 millimeters? We don't have a definition that includes a percentage of that less than 2 millimeters that we can say, yes, this is the line in the sand, it's crushed rock or not. But regardless of whether I as a QP look at a pile of crushed shale and I say, I think that it's rock and I don't have to sample it, some other QP can disagree with me. And where are you going to take that shale at the end of the day? So I don't know of any reuse sites right now that would accept shale without some type of quality sampling, which leads to another issue, which is how do you sample the shale? It would be fine if you had an excavated pile of shale and you could maybe grab some of the fines and send it to the lab as we would for soil, but a lot of the times you've got large chunks, or if you are working downtown Toronto, you don't have the room to excavate your shale, stockpile it, and wait. So you're stuck coring your shale. And now you've got a nice chunk of rock that you're trying to send to the lab to be analyzed as soil. You can either try and crush it yourself, or you can have a few of the labs crush it for you. There are no standard procedures or MECP guidance on what is expected for crushing rock that is to be analyzed as soil, and every lab does it differently. And you can get different results, which is interesting. So there's an issue there. And then also, once you get your analytical results, if you're testing shale, it's quite common that you might encounter naturally occurring exceedances of these soil standards. And so my best advice is, if you have shale on your site, test it ahead of time, even if it's just a couple of cores during a geotech investigation. You're drilling anyway. Test your shale, because yeah, you might think testing shale is expensive, but what's more expensive is thinking that, okay, I've got a line item for sending all my shale to this site to be reused, but it can't be sent there, and now you're stuck with a change order for all of it to go to a landfill, which can be multi-million-dollar problem. So,
Anyone else?
I think what I'd add to this dialogue is, remembering that I'm in the business of the policy levers at hand and all that stuff. So basically, just think about the site-specific instruments and what they're capable of doing now. I did take notes a little bit. I think I've heard some of these things before, but I took notes anyway. And there's no shortage of things to consider. But I would just suggest to you to consider what site-specific instruments such as bylaws an ARA license and so forth can do now. So for example, one of the conditions for liquid soil at one of the conditions for excess soil at a reuse site under Section 3 is that the soil must be dry, or if it's liquid, then the site-specific instrument allows the deposit there. So as you look for flexibility in managing these things, I encourage you to think about that site-specific tool piece that we put in there.
Ponds. Everyone hates storm ponds, but everyone has them and everyone works on them. I see a wide range of approaches. Probably a best practice approach that I've seen most effective is municipalities are pre-qualifying contractors that they team up with on pond jobs. The other one would be pre-plan, early planning on your pond. Draw it down. Try to make that soil as dry as possible. And it'll save you on the transportation and excavation costs as well. So yeah, ponds are a problem. No one likes them, but they're excess soil. So we got to deal with it.
I'm stuck on shale still. And I was just thinking that 25 million cubic meters of soil, how much of that was shale? I would love that number.
Maybe there's a role for RIPRA. I'm big on benchmarking, and I know that their mandate is pretty narrow, but I think they should start tracking through whatever means. Kevin this morning was talking about just through soil flow. I think there was 7 million cubes. So if you take all of the groups out there that are tracking and then the stuff that isn't tracked, let's try to get that information.
Andy, I talked to many municipalities and they don't know, like they haven't historically tracked how much soil they've been generating because it's all been in their contracts and the contractors are taking care of it. So I think this next year, municipalities will start understanding what their soil amounts or soil exposure and the soil costs are going to be. And we're going to get to more, Freesia will get to know her shale number of the 25 million. And we'll all have more clarity on pond numbers and dry soil. So it's all about analytics.
Exactly. Okay. Question 6, and then we'll go to some questions I already have from the audience right here. So this is the last one that's been predetermined. Do you think there are lessons to be learned from one region, such as Ontario, that can be applied in another, taking into account regional differences, of course? Could also bring up the regulations discussed in the previous regulatory panel and cross-reference. I probably shouldn't have read that, but I think what we're talking about here is, can we have a higher return on investment through better management practices? Who wants to start?
I mentioned earlier the CCME has come up with some guidance, which I think is taking some of the pieces from the different provinces and putting it together in a framework, and hopefully that'll help bridge the gap. I'd like to look at the one that I know the best is the example in Ontario, which was a phased approach. And even with all the thought processes and planning and discussions that the ministry's gone through, there are still issues that are coming up, and there's requests for delays and so forth. So I think the phased approach is important because not one person can predict every site-specific, job-specific situation that may come up and may be impacted by the regulations. So I believe the phased approach for other provinces is probably a good method.
Pick it up. Okay.
So yeah, I think that, yes, of course we can learn from other jurisdictions. And what I think we pull away from it, two things are big takeaways that seem to work for everybody. So talking about, hiring QP as a best practice, not it's always mandatory, and doing it, like those are, you hear like that echoed a lot because it's coming universal. Like I would just say from the prior learning, in the last couple of years, my work hasn't taken me to the interjurisdictional area as much, but I remember learning about the BC framework and, I think it was contaminated soil relocation agreements, and there may have been, like they may have, just like us, encountered the issue about where do we set the threshold, and that may have been a challenge. So what I see when I look at other jurisdictions, like we've learned a lot from them, but I also see the similar challenge. Where do you set, like all those things, like 2,000 cubic meters and whatever, lots of thinking goes into that. And I see other jurisdictions having to face the same hurdles, and they do so well, but it's certainly not an overnight process. But yeah, what I took away from the BC CSRA thing was, when do you trigger it? When do you not? Do you set it too low, too high, what have you? And that helped inform when we set the 2,000 cubic meters to think about that. And it's an ongoing battle. It's not solved overnight, that's for sure.
I remembered. I would say that for any jurisdictions looking to create these excess soil or reuse of soil, make sure that you have a robust outreach program, especially if you have rural areas or underserviced areas. I know that some of the municipalities outside of the GTA have felt like they were kind of left in the dark and they didn't know what was going on. And that's the same for some of the small contractors. So make sure that you're trying to really catch everyone.
I think we're in such an infancy stage that we don't know what's best. Working as a country, pulling the good parts from BC, pulling the good parts from Ontario. The CCME document that we found out about last week on our call, fantastic. They provided some gold standards. As long as we're following the same principles, ESG, limiting truck traffic, trying to reuse as much soil as possible, tracking the soil, and creating those controls. That's a great framework. And then down to the municipal level, I'm going to take this from Grant. He taught me this last week. Some municipalities don't even have fill permits or fill bylaws. So, looking at those municipalities to maybe to come up to the new age, or adopt best practices, adopt these documents that various associations are building. We don't have all the answers. This is a massive experiment. I believe we're doing things right in Ontario and in BC and in Quebec. It's going to be, what are the other provinces and the states, our friendly neighbors to the south, what are they going to do? And looking at European models as well. There's lots to pull from. It's just adopting them and trying them out.
Okay, thanks, gang. If I can just add one thing, this is my moderator's prerogative. In the 2016 framework document, there was a recommendation to do more pilot projects. So I know some were done with ministry assistance, and I think that would be a good way for us to learn some lessons, what might have worked effectively and what didn't work so well, but really then publicize what happened to those pilot projects to learn from them. So I have a pile of questions here. And some of them aren't really best practices, so if we have time, we'll get to those other ones. But this one I thought was right on the mark. What would you recommend as a best practice for soil that is consolidated from exempt activities such as emergency works or state of repair?
That falls into the example of probably the local waste transfer facility. I do some work for some of the cities and municipalities around where I work, and they are bringing that material in together from emergencies and roadworks and sewer repairs and so forth. They bring it there, they consolidate it to a certain size, and then they call their contractor who looks after that and the QP to come in and do the characterization on that, do the obligatory number of samples per the pile size, and do a good a smattering of analytical that would make sense, and get that characterization done, and then determine from that characterization what types of sites it could be relocated to. Then a company like GFL often comes in and moves the material to one of their facilities and so forth. So using the local waste transfer facility model is I think it's wise where it can be done. Where it can't be done, I think there should be, and I've brought this up with Sanjay and his group, that maybe an easier model could be developed for an approval of a facility where you've got the controls in place to operate such like that as a private entity, like a contractor may be able to do that. But I've been talking with Sanjay and Chris and Laura before that on finding a way to make that a simple process. So it's not a year and a half to get an ECA, but through an easier process where you're answering a series of questions, demonstrating that you have the number of controls in place, and then operating under an easier appointment. And I think that's still being considered, I hope.
Okay, next question. This one's tracking at 6 thumbs up already. Does the ministry have plans to revisit and revise the soil independent standards over time? The standards are quite stringent, and it goes on and on and on. Do not meet the standards for table 2.1. Alternatively, improve the BRAT and risk assessment mechanisms to allow QPs to assess adverse impacts may help.
So I think the answer is I can't say like it's not like it's in a regulation or as within this period we're going to revisit these standards, but it's an ongoing discussion. There has not been a single, there's not been a single email that we don't actually read and consider and so forth. Amending standards, so that we're all to manage your expectations. The standards are contained in the rules document in part 2. that means that it requires cabinet approval to change. So it is a bit of a longer process. This is unlike part 1 of the rules document, which is what we call adopted by reference, and it's easier to change. So for example, that soil storage pile size piece is actually a little bit more nimble, and there are good legal reasons behind that. So the answer is that there isn't a formal, we will review the standards and provide a report within 5 years piece in the reg. However, we do read the comments that we receive. Where, if there are concerns, happy to hear them out. And I will say, though, that to manage your expectations, or if there are any, that actually I'd like to also speak to the easer piece similarly. So if we wanted to amend the soil standards, there is a bit of a process because it does require cabinet approval. That is in the part 2 of the rules document. Secondly, I think I've heard easer a couple of times today, and I say it with great appreciation. We know what the principles of easer are. It's permit by rule, and so basically you have a few stated conditions, and slam, you can get through an easer. One thing I will say that for everybody's awareness is that the easer regulation itself, the way that easer works is that there's a regulation behind it. And to do a regulation, just like many other regulations, not every single one, but you have the consultation. In this case, I'm 95% certain you go to cabinet to do that kind of reg. So the point is that those particular mechanisms, easers and standards, we're happy to hear out those issues and those concerns. But I do want to manage your expectations about the process involved, because there's some other pieces of our policy framework that are a bit easier to change. And we did that on purpose, but there are certain things that you can't say, no cabinet, you don't get a chance to oversee this. We can't actually do
Right,
that.
and the standards becoming more stringent, and everyone kind of, what's going on here, crying, they got to take more samples, and they're moving the goalposts. There are tools available, the BRAT, for these reuse sites, you have this new number, but you can also go and deploy a BRAT. So have a QP, so they do a site, like a site study and experiment on your reuse site, and they can create site-specific standards. The Poor Lands project, for example, they did a bunch of RAs on site, and now they had 9 beneficial reuse site standards for various soil piles. So how municipalities permit these sites as well. There are so many tools. I think it's a very poignant point to go right at the tables, and they're too strict. There are a lot of abilities to increase, maneuver, manage within the guidelines as well. So.
This one is tracking at 7 votes, and it goes back to you, Sanjay, and I know you probably can't answer. What is the ministry's plan for enforcement of 40619?
Yeah, so I think that we are fully, I appreciated the comment this morning about comparing this to the Brownfields reg. The Brownfields reg came out very early in my career, and I think that I've seen the parallels there. The bottom line is very simply, we know, and I thought that the talk this morning put it very well. So I appreciated that comment. I think it was Mr. Sutton that did that, so thank you for that. The bottom line is that we know, but am I in a position to say, well, we are going to do this many inspections or have this many officers in the field? I am not. But we know is what I think can be done.
Okay, do we have time for one more? Okay. Is there any guidance available on setting up a soil bank site? Is there a list of established soil bank sites available? And I'm thinking back about a dozen years ago or 10 years ago, the region of Waterloo was setting up this particular facility, but I don't think it had the momentum to keep going, but maybe someone can start with
I know
that.
7 sites that are soil bank sites. No, it's just bad.
Are they all green?
There are some tools, a soil, if you're taking in more than 10,000 cubic meters of soil, either for processing, reuse, or banking, I believe it has to be on the registry if you're taking in 10,000 cubes. So the RIPA registry is a source. There's some online tools. There's apps that are coming out. Again, infancy stages, market. We're a very low-tech industry. that in construction that's the tech world is starting to come our way. Digital tracking softwares could maybe enhance and be a vehicle or a forum for these sites as well. There's sites called like Dirt Market, Get Fill that are all have available soil bank or soil storage sites as well. And then the municipalities are getting involved in this as well.
Yeah, so for soil banking, you need an ECA right now, is my understanding. Pardon? Okay. So, going through that ECA process is a long, arduous process. I don't know if there's any other mechanism.
The last time when I was doing a consultation for a client, I was speaking with them in the waste department of the ECA section, and I'd asked them point blank, was there any soil bank applications that come in, and they had not. Now that was about 12 months ago. I asked them that question. There was not any to their knowledge. One thing I would point out is in Ontario we have such a wide range of geotechnical properties of our soil. We have silts, we have clays, we have granulars, and so forth, that it would be taking on a huge risk to operate a soil bank because you may end up with soils that you cannot use. And what do you do with those then? You could end up receiving inadvertently contaminated soil or soil of a certain quality that you cannot reuse. So those are the things that would have to be under strict consideration if you were deciding to go out and start a soil bank. Trust me, I've thought about it. I've talked to other people. I've talked to people, clients in the industry who may be well-heeled or have the know-how and so forth, and it is a risk, and a risk that I don't think most people are willing to take.
Can I just actually offer one thing? Yeah, I appreciate the answers that have been given. Just one quick clarification though, and I appreciate it coming up, and forgive me for this. The 10,000 cubic meters piece, that's for reuse sites. So it's section 19 of the regulation. It is one of the pause, and I totally understand a little bit because it's one of the things that came into effect for 4 months and then was paused and now it's coming back into effect. But that 10,000, I'm changing the topic a little bit, but yeah, the pause requirements are coming back on. The pause requirements weren't everything, and that was one of them.
Excess soil is excess soil. Unless it's if it follows the rules, it's excess soil. Then it's waste. So I think that there's a persona or a perception for communities, municipalities that are permitting these sites, either class 1, soil banks, what have it, that waste is synonymous with garbage. This is excess soil. So we're moving away from that waste profile. So there needs to be more education, more latitude to get more of these sites, understanding that we're doing the right thing. It's not garbage. There's not seagulls flying around everywhere, right? There is excess soil as a resource, and it's a purpose why we're trying to do this and get it managed. So yeah, the perception in Ontario or maybe across Canada is typically soil's been going to landfills as waste. It's not waste anymore. It's excess soil, and it's a resource.
Okay, thanks. We do have time? Okay. One more. Will the reg, and this is a topical current event, will the reg be affected by some of the steps the Ontario government is taking to increase or encourage housing development given the lack of it in Ontario?
One of these questions is impossible to say yes or no. Yes, totally. Like, the reality is this, we know that housing is a major priority. We also know that we want to make these processes robust and good and protect the environment, allowing for economic opportunity and so forth. So, I'm not going to say that there's a direct linkage between between some of these things we do and that, but for sure, is it part of the broader cloud that we think about the priorities? Yes, I think that that's fair, but I don't think it would be actually fair. Most of the time that we spend on excess soil, we think about the discussions like we've just been having. Actually, it's like, oh, shale and these thing and that thing. Okay, let's create a new carve out and whatever. So my answer to that would be, in the broader ecosphere, it's a consideration. But to say it's direct, like this, therefore that, no, I don't think that's truly the case.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else? Thoughts?
Not touching that one.
Yeah, not a politician.
Well, just an observation. In the old days, when lots were typically 50 feet, and you dug a basement, you could move some of that fill to the backyard. With intensification, that's difficult. So housing does generate more soil that must be transported off-site, unless they build estate housing along the 413, but I don't want to get into that one. Todd's looking at me. So please give a round of applause to this phenomenal panel.